Old Man Consequences is one of the strangest, quietest, and most philosophically loaded figures in Five Nights at Freddy, and his power comes almost entirely from how little he explains himself. He does not chase, threaten, or jump scare. He sits by a lake, speaks in short, calm sentences, and offers a single piece of advice. Leave the demon to his demons. Rest your own soul. There is nothing else. In a series defined by noise, panic, and relentless punishment, Old Man Consequences feels like a deliberate rupture in tone, as if the game itself pauses to ask whether endless suffering actually serves a purpose. Because of that, any analysis of him has to treat him less like a conventional character and more like a moral or metaphysical intervention. Old Man Consequences first appears in Five Nights at Freddy's World, a game that is often dismissed as non-canon but has repeatedly proven to be thematically essential. His pixelated, almost mythic presentation immediately separates him from the rest of the cast. He is not an animatronic, not a ghost child, and not tied to any restaurant or suit. He exists in a liminal space, a red void, a still lake, a fishing rod, and silence. This setting alone signals that Old Man Consequences is operating on a different narrative layer, one that deals with souls and consequences rather than events and locations. Even before he speaks, the game communicates that he is not part of the cycle of violence, but an observer who understands it. The advice Old Man Consequences gives is deceptively simple, yet it cuts directly to the heart of the series' central conflict. Leave the demon to his demons is almost universally interpreted as referring to William Afton, the architect of so much suffering, but the second half of the statement, rest your own soul, is more revealing. It implies that the listener, often read as Cassidy or another vengeful spirit, is trapped not because of what was done to them, but because of what they refuse to let go. Old Man Consequences is not defending Afton or minimizing his crimes. Instead, he is drawing a line between justice and obsession. Punishment has already occurred. What remains is self-inflicted torment. This interpretation becomes even stronger in Ultimate Custom Night, where Old Man Consequences reappears in a form that directly interacts with the player's choices. Triggering his minigame and choosing to drown yourself ends the night immediately, cutting through the endless loop of torture that defines the game. That act is not framed as defeat or death, but as release. In contrast to the rest of the game, which rewards endurance and mastery of suffering, Old Man Consequences offers an escape that requires surrender. This positions him as the only entity in the series who actively advocates for an end to the cycle rather than its continuation. The relationship between Old Man Consequences and Cassidy is especially important. If Cassidy is the vengeful soul anchoring William Afton in an endless purgatory, then Old Man Consequences functions as her counterbalance. He does not challenge her power, he challenges her purpose. His dialogue suggests that there is a moral cost to unending revenge, even when that revenge is justified. The phrase, "there is nothing else," is not nihilistic, it's final. It suggests that beyond a certain point, suffering stops producing meaning. What remains is stagnation. Symbolically, Old Man Consequences draws heavily from archetypes outside traditional horror. He resembles a psychopomp or ferryman, figures from mythology who guide souls between states of being. The lake he sits beside evokes the river Styx, a boundary rather than a destination. Fishing, in this context, can be read as waiting rather than hunting. He is not there to force souls to move on, only to offer the opportunity. This further reinforces the idea that Old Man Consequences respects agency. He provides wisdom, not commands. The color red associated with Old Man Consequences is also worth examining. Red in Five Nights at Freddy's is often tied to danger, violence, and guilt, but Old Man Consequences' red environment feels subdued rather than aggressive. It's less the red of alarms and more the red of warning signs long ignored. This visual choice subtly suggests that he embodies accumulated consequence rather than active threat. He is what remains after the chaos has burned itself out. Another key aspect of Old Man Consequences is his indifference to the player's success or failure. He does not reward you with lore dumps, unlockables, or validation. His message does not change no matter how deeply you engage with the game's systems. This is rare in a franchise built on secrets and mastery. It implies that some truths are not earned through effort or cleverness, but accepted through understanding. In other words, Old Man Consequences represents a truth that cannot be solved, only acknowledged. Importantly, Old Man Consequences also reframes the player's role in the series. By the time he appears in Ultimate Custom Night, the player is no longer just a victim or a survivor, but an active participant in perpetuating punishment. The endless nights, escalating difficulty, and absence of narrative progression all mirror Cassidy's fixation. Old Man Consequences breaks the fourth wall in a subtle way, suggesting that the player, like the spirit they may represent, must choose whether continuing is meaningful or merely habitual. There are interpretations that see Old Man Consequences as a manifestation of a higher cosmic order, or even as the voice of the game's creator, gently nudging both character and player toward closure. While speculative, these readings align with how out of place he feels compared to every other entity in the series. He does not belong to Fazbear Entertainment's world, he belongs to the moral framework surrounding it. He exists to ask a question the rest of the franchise avoids: what happens after revenge succeeds? Ultimately, Old Man Consequences matters because he introduces the possibility that endless suffering is not the end point of the story. In a franchise obsessed with loops, nights repeating, animatronics resetting, trauma resurfacing, he is the only character who acknowledges that cycles can end, but only if someone chooses to step out of them. He does not absolve guilt, erase pain, or undo the past. He simply offers rest. That offer is what makes him unsettling, not because he is threatening, but because he is right. Old Man Consequences stands as the quiet conscience of Five Nights at Freddy's, a reminder that justice without mercy curdles into cruelty, and that even the most justified anger can become its own prison. In a world built on screams and machinery, his soft-spoken warning is one of the most disturbing moments in the entire series, not because it frightens, but because it asks whether the horror should finally be allowed to end. One of the most interesting layers of Old Man Consequences as a concept, where he comes from matters less in a literal, physical sense and far more in a metaphysical and narrative one, because unlike almost every other figure in Five Nights at Freddy's, Old Man Consequences does not emerge from an accident, a murder, or a machine. He feels like something that pre-exists the story rather than something created by it. There is also a question of where did he come from. One of the strongest interpretations is that Old Man Consequences comes from outside Fazbear Entertainment's cycle entirely. Every other entity in the series can be traced back to a location, a suit, a crime, or a failure of corporate negligence. Old Man Consequences has none of those anchors. He has no restaurant, no animatronic shell, no backstory tied to a date or incident. His environment is abstract and symbolic, suggesting that he exists on a plane closer to the rules governing souls than to the events that trap them. In this sense, he may originate from the same unseen system that allows spirits to linger in the first place, a kind of natural law or corrective force that only becomes visible when that system is being abused. Another compelling possibility is that Old Man Consequences is a manifestation of accumulated guilt and consequence, rather than an independent being. If William Afton represents action without conscience, and Cassidy represents consequence without mercy, then Old Man Consequences could be what forms when those two extremes collide for too long. He would not be born from a single death, but from the aftermath of many deaths left unresolved. This would explain his age, his patience, and his exhaustion. He does not speak like someone newly aware of injustice. He speaks like someone who has watched the same mistakes repeat endlessly and has learned that force no longer works. There is also a strong argument that Old Man Consequences originates from the crying child's side of the narrative, rather than Cassidy's. The crying child is associated with fear, regret, and emotional overwhelm rather than rage. His story is about being crushed by circumstances he never understood, and his final moments emphasize confusion and sorrow rather than vengeance. Old Man Consequences' tone aligns much more closely with that emotional register. If Cassidy embodies refusal to move on, Old Man Consequences could be what remains of a soul, or a perspective, that has moved on and now looks back with clarity. In that reading, he is not a separate character at all, but a distilled voice of acceptance that emerges once pain is no longer driving action. Some theories push this further and suggest that Old Man Consequences could originate from a prior victim we never meet, someone from an earlier incident whose story ended before the main timeline even began. This would explain why he feels ancient compared to the other spirits and why he shows no personal anger. He has already passed through the stage Cassidy is stuck in. He is not speaking from theory, he is speaking from experience. The lake becomes a metaphorical resting place, not for him, but for the souls he waits to guide once they are ready. There is also a meta-narrative interpretation worth taking seriously. Old Man Consequences may come from the boundary between the game and the player. His dialogue in Ultimate Custom Night doesn't just address an in-universe character, it addresses the mindset of endurance, obsession, and refusal to stop. In that sense, he originates from the moment the story recognizes its own loop. He exists because the cycle has gone on long enough to require commentary. This would make him less a character and more a narrative pressure valve, created when suffering becomes excessive even by the story's own logic. Importantly, wherever Old Man Consequences comes from, he is defined by what he is not. He is not trapped, he is not screaming, he is not trying to win. That alone places his origin somewhere beyond the events that bind everyone else. His fishing rod suggests waiting, not pursuit. His stillness suggests understanding, not ignorance. Whether he originates from a higher cosmic order, a resolved soul, or the narrative itself reaching self-awareness, the common thread is that he comes from a place after pain, not during it. In the end, the most unsettling answer to where Old Man Consequences comes from is this. He may come from the future the story is refusing to reach. He represents what exists once the anger burns out, once punishment stops feeling productive, once someone finally asks what all this suffering was for. That is why he feels so out of place, and why he only appears when the cycle has gone too far. Old Man Consequences doesn't emerge because something went wrong. He emerges because nothing has been allowed to end.